There's a little bit of everything here. Now, most of this furniture came from overseas, and it was painted originally. They were stripped over there, brought to this country for our American buyers. But you know, the thing that's really interesting is the wood itself, this look of the pine, the color, the texture, the warmth of it. You just can't duplicate that with stain. And look at this, a beautiful corner cupboard. But this is the piece I've been looking all over for, a classic console table with nicely formed legs, curved rails, and a nice knotty pine top. A very useful and elegant piece. Let's take a look underneath and see what we have. Oh, look at this. These curved rails were cut from one solid piece of wood, and apparently it didn't hold up very well because there's a block here used as a repair. There's a better way to do that. And look here, there's a spline. It appears that at one time, maybe two of these tables were joined together to make one round one. This is a piece that we're just going to have to make. I'll take a couple measurements. Now, what do you think? Here it is, our version of the console table. I kept the proportions pretty much the same as the antique original and made the top out of a knotty pine. But the frame and the legs are all made from a clear pine. Now, I did make a couple significant construction detail changes. And if you remember, on the antique original, the curved rails were cut from a single piece of wood. And that's very weak, particularly at the ends, where the tenons are the most important part. Now, this rail looks like it's been cut from a single piece of wood, but this is just a decorative molding that's sitting on top of the rail, which I made from 6 pieces of wood glued and laminated together to form the shape of the curve, the strongest way to do it. The other thing was that the antique original had the top fastened with screws driven directly into the rails. That restricts it from moving. In fact, it pushed the table apart. What I've done is installed cleats with elongated holes that allow the top to expand and contract. I also want to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, to get started today, I want to make those curved rails. And the first step is to take this piece of 1x8 select pine, which has no knots in it, and rip 2 strips 2 5/8 inches wide. To make the next step a little bit easier, I'm going to cut these pieces in half. So now I've got 4 pieces about 32 inches long, which is longer than what I really need. And I want to rip along the 3/4 inch width twice, giving me 3 thin strips. So I've set up my table saw with what's known as a thin kerf saw blade. I've set it about 3/16 of an inch away from the rip fence, and now I'm just going to carefully run the pieces through. Now, you might notice that I'm trying to keep these boards, these individual pieces that I've ripped, in the same orientation as they were in the original piece. And that's so that when I go to do the glue up, I'll get the best possible bond between the pieces because the cuts are going to match. First thing that I did when I started this project was make a full-scale pattern from which I could lay things out throughout the project. If you could look through this pattern, through the tabletop, the top of the leg would be right here, the center leg, which is this marking. Over here is one of the end legs, and these 2 lines represent the inside and outside of the rail. Working from a center line, I was able to determine the various radii that I needed. One is this inside curve, which I needed to make a template to bend those rails. Knowing that information and using my bandsaw, I cut some pieces of 3/4 inch plywood to form this jig, fastened them to a larger piece of plywood, installed some spacer blocks, and then another piece of plywood because I want good solid bearing at the bottom and at the top of the form. Now you really only need to make one of these, but I made two so that I could bend both rails at the same time. Now the trick here is to glue it quickly and to get it all clamped in place before the glue sets up. Now I'm just using a yellow carpenter's glue, and this roller allows me to spread it out quickly. Okay, now I want to make sure that I put glue on all sides of all pieces, not just one side. It's amazing how much stronger these thin pieces are when they're all glued up and bent to form the shape than a solid piece of wood would be. Okay, all glued up. Now, we don't have a lot of time, and clamps are the most important thing right now, plenty of them. First I'll clamp one end tight to the jig, as close to the end as possible. Now using this quick release clamp, I'm going to just start to bend the pieces around. I'm going to try to pull them. I'm just going to use this clamp to gradually ease it towards the jig. Okay, I think it's time to throw on another clamp. This time from this side. Now squeeze it in a little more. And also I want to pay attention to make sure that the top of these individual pieces stay as even to one another as possible and tight down onto the bottom of the jig. I don't want them to start riding up next to one another. Okay, time for another clamp. I understand they make violins and guitars the same way. Now you can begin to see how the boards will slip by one another a little bit. That's what's supposed to happen. You know, if I get real good at bending forms like this, maybe I can try a spiral staircase someday. Okay. Do you remember that line? Too thin or too rich. I would add to that, you can never have enough clamps. Okay. Well, now you can see what I mean by saying you can never have too many clamps. You're going to have to let these rails sit in the form for at least 12 hours before they're unclamped. And at that time, they'll actually stay in the shape of the form. So while those are drying, I think I'll start working on the legs, which are not a laminated piece of wood. Actually, they're a solid piece of sugar pine. Now, when I went down to my wood outlet, I went immediately to the short pile. In other words, there's a pile of cutoffs. And I was lucky enough to find a piece of 3-inch thick sugar pine that was about 16 inches wide and 3 feet long. A little bit pricey, $70, but that was enough to make 6 legs, or enough for 2 tables. I've already cut off 3 for the prototype, and now I'm going to rip 3 more pieces 2 1/8 inches wide. Now, using my jointer, I'm smoothing the sawn edges. Now, using a template that I made from some poster board of the leg from the original, I'm going to trace the outline on the blank, and then I'll cut it over at my bandsaw. I've been spending some time carefully laying out the mortises and the holes for the dowel pins in all the legs. I also took a little time to pick which leg would look the best for the front center, because that's the one you're going to see the most. And I chose this one because it has the tightest grain. I also label the legs, right, center, and left, as you look at the table from the front, because they are not interchangeable, and it can get a little confusing as I move through the project. Now, this is the left leg. It has 2 mortises. One right here that's a 1/2 inch in from the front, and that'll accept the curved rail. Then there's another one on the adjacent side that's about 1/4 of an inch in from the back, and that will accept this long back rail. Now the leg for the front of the table has a slightly different mortise setup. There's a mortise that goes on each side, opposite sides, and it goes all the way through to receive each of the curved rails. I'll make all the mortises over at the drill press. Well, as usual, I'm cutting my mortises using my drill press, which is set up with the mortising attachment. Nothing more than a square chisel through which a drill bit passes. The bit removes the bulk of the material, and the chisel squares it up. In order to cut the mortise in the right and left leg for the long back rail, I've moved my guide fence back about 1/4 of an inch. You can see here that if I simply put the leg in position, it is tilted because of the curvature. So in order to hold the leg perpendicular to the bit, I'm just going to use a couple pieces of scrap as a shim. Our table has tapered legs, and that's to give it a look of lightness, and it makes it a little more graceful. The center leg is tapered on each side. The right and left legs are tapered on the side that faces you, or the side that meets the curved rail. To make the tapers, I'm going to use my tapering jig. It's just a couple pieces of oak with a pivot on one end, an adjustment bar on the other end, and a stop block to push the stock through. I've now set it up for the right and left leg. So as I start to push the jig into place, I have about 2 1/4 inches space. As I go through to the other end, I come to about 1 1/8 inches. Now, in order not to get confused, I always want to keep in mind that on the right and left leg, I taper the side with the mortise for the curved rail. The center leg is tapered on each side, and the end result down at the bottom for width that I want is about equal to the right or left leg. But to keep the leg symmetrical, I'm going to have to taper each side just a little bit. Now, if I use the jig as I have it set up for the back legs, I'm actually going to remove too much because I'm going to come along and cut right about to the center here. I want to end up right here, which is about half as much of a taper. So the first thing I have to do is move my fence over about 1/2 inch for the tapering jig, and I also have to move my rip fence in about 1/16 of an inch for that first pass. These curved rail blanks have had plenty of time to dry. Let's see how they hold their form. Pretty good. Now I'm just going to plane the edge that I just scraped. Now that I've got one edge of my curved rails smooth and true, I can place that edge against my fence to rip the rail to the correct width. The idea here is to hold the rail tight to the table saw surface and against the fence and slowly guide it through. Now here at my drum sander, I'm smoothing the face and trying to make the face as perpendicular as possible to the bottom edge. Let's take another look at our full-scale template. This square represents the front center leg, and the curved lines represent the rail. I've roughly sketched in where the tenon will show up. I've taken my blank and set it over the template and used the combination square to draw this line on the front, which is a shoulder cut, another one across the top, and one on the back side. I've also laid out the tenon itself. Now it's to be cut. Now that the end cut and the cheek cuts are made, I'll cut the shoulders by hand. Well, I suppose I could have made these shoulder cuts using my bandsaw and a fresh blade, but I think this little dovetailing saw is more accurate. These cuts form the top and bottom of the tenon. I'll finish them off by hand. Now this long piece is for the back rail, and I can make all the cuts necessary to form the tenon either using the table saw or the bandsaw. Using a rasp and sometimes a sharp chisel, I'm fine-tuning all the tenons so that they fit in the mortises just snug like that. Let's take a quick look at the prototype. There is a molded piece that's attached to the bottom of the rail. Now, before I glue anything up, I want to form that piece. I suppose I could just take the rail and trace the outline, cut it freehand on the bandsaw, and then trim the ends. But there's a much more accurate way to make the cut. That's using a circle cutter attachment for my bandsaw. You see a series of holes along a line that is perpendicular and straight off the axis of the blade. Every hole represents the radius of the circle to be cut. Now, taking a piece of scrap plywood and nailing it to the bottom of the blank, I can now place it over the radius pin and make the first cut. Now I'm simply going to relocate the pin about 1.25 inches closer to the blade and make the second pass. Okay, with glue on the tenons and in the mortise, I can slip it together. You might have noticed that there's some little blocks that have been screwed to the rail. I'll show you what those are for. Those that assist me in clamping. This allows me to pull everything tightly together. Now this is how I clamp the rear leg, or the side leg, to the curved rail. Okay, now the back rail requires no special clamping blocks, just the clamp. And after I finish pinning this leg in place, I can do the final back corner. The trim pieces are glued and nailed in place with some brads. Let's take a look at the underside of our prototype. The top is held in place by screws which pass through these small cleats that have tongues on the end and fit into grooves cut in the rails. So here on the workbench, I've set down some scrap pieces of pine, set the assembled base on top of it, and marked where the cleat will meet the rail. I've also marked a line across the cleat and then extended 3/8 of an inch on each end for the tongues. The slots are cut in the rails using a 1/4 inch slot cutting bit. Now, using the same bit that I used to make the slots, except this time in a position to form a rabbet, I've started to make the tongue on the cleats. I only need a tongue on each end, but it looks better to run the piece all the way around. Glue and a couple brads hold the cleats in place. Some 3/16 inch holes that I've elongated by rocking the drill will hold the top in place and allow it to move. Now, this is a good time to clean up the excess dowel. Well, I've just got a little more sanding to do on this blank, which I made up of 3½ pieces of 1x8, and it's for the top. Assembled it with glue and biscuits. Well, once again, I'm going to turn to my circle cutting jig to form the top. I've drilled a pilot hole in the bottom of the blank. I'm going to slip it over my pivot pin, which I've installed on the right radius measurement, and I'll just run it through. Well, a 1/4 inch roundover bit in the router does a good job at easing the edges of the top, both on the front side and underneath. And now the base gets fastened to the top with a few 1¼ inch screws, and this piece is ready for the finish. Now, once I was sure the top fit, I removed it so that it'll be easier to stain and finish both sides of it. Now, the look that I want for this table is sort of a country pine, an English country pine. So I made my own stain this time around. I couldn't find anything that was quite right. It's just a combination of some artist colors, a little bit of mineral spirits, some varnish, and some linseed oil. Boy, I'm really pleased with the way this table turned out. The knotty pine top, combined with the stain that we made up, really gives it that warm country feeling. And it was a lot of fun to build.